Well, greetings, everybody. I'm glad to be back with you here. I guess this is a follow-up to the interview we had earlier in the spring. I think it was March or April. So it's an appropriate time after almost 6 months, to see where we've been the last 6 months, where we are now, late August, and where we might be going. I guess those are the three themes I'd like to address here in chatting with you. Just to review briefly the previous presentation in March, April, the ideas, the themes at that time were that we were entering a Great Recession, not a normal recession. It was going to be very serious. It was not going to be a V-shaped recovery. It was going to be at best a W-shaped recovery, which is typical of all great recessions we've had in the past. So the V-shaped recovery was a big myth at the time. And of course, now almost no one talks about V-shaped recovery. Unprecedented deep contraction, I predicted. And of course, that's come true here in the second quarter. I also argued that the fiscal stimulus that was introduced in March, April, called the CARES Act, was going to be insufficient and inadequate to generate a sustained recovery. And I'll address that a little bit further as well. Also, I said it would get worse. In a Great Recession, what you have is an initial rebound from the deep contraction that sets it off. But the rebound is not a recovery. It's not a sustained recovery. It's just natural because you can't keep dropping at 30–40% every quarter. But the rebound would dissipate and we would have a relapse. And then you would have either another rebound. So you get this series of deep contraction followed by a modest rebound, another weakening, short, shallow stagnation, or even a double dip recession, followed by another rebound, and you can bounce along the bottom that way for years. And that's kind of what we did after 2008 and 9. And in other previous Great Recessions, the same thing happened. Great Recessions are always kind of like an anteroom. You either tame it and it falls back to a normal protracted recession, or if you don't tame it, if you don't have fiscal and monetary stimulus adequate, you can have another subsequent serious crash, usually precipitated by financial crises, banking crises, and that drives you into a bona fide Great Depression. So we're kind of in this interim period, kind of a juncture between what is a Great Recession we're already in, clearly W-shaped recovery, and whether or not we will spill over into something even more serious. Now, mainstream economists have already begun talking about this. I'm not alone, finally. We have this well-known pair of economists, Carmen Reinhart and Vincent Reinhart. Carmen is the World Bank chief economist, and her husband, Vincent, is the chief economist for Mellon Bank. And both of them are coming out in another week or so in the Foreign Affairs Journal with a article saying we're slipping into a Great Depression here. Foreign Affairs is a very prestigious capitalist policymaker journal that all the big boys read here. And they're not pulling any punches, and they're saying, we're on the verge or already in, they call it the pandemic depression. And then Paul Krugman has a recent piece that come out in New York Times, and Paul, of course, pulls his punches as he always does, and he calls this the Greater Recession. Not a Great Recession, but a greater one. I don't know, maybe that puts everything somewhere between a Great Recession and a Depression. But anyway, major mainstream economists are beginning to come around to what I was predicting back in March. So we are at a very serious juncture. And in the spring, I said to get out of this, we would have to spend $4 trillion in fiscal stimulus, not monetary, fiscal. And the fiscal stimulus would have to be targeted largely to people who would really spend it, households. So we'll look at that theme as well here. So having said that, that's what I talked about in the spring. What's happened? You know, that's where we've been. What's happened over the last 6 months? Well, first of all, very clearly, we've had a massive contraction of the economy, worst quarter contraction in U.S. history, recorded data history, worse than any quarter even during the 1930s. The U.S. economy collapsed at a 33% annual rate. In other words, if the collapse kept going, it'd be 33%, a third of the economy. We lost $4 trillion in GDP in just 3 months. And it's not just the United States, it's everywhere. Germany contracted 34%, the Eurozone 40% overall. The UK, 52%, half of its economy shut down. Japan, 27%. China went under a contraction earlier in the first quarter of almost 7%. Okay, and what we saw in real terms, not just GDP terms, was that we had unemployment claims every week of more than 2 million people filing for unemployment. In a couple of weeks there in March, we had like 6.5 million each week. And we've had over 2 million every week for 23 consecutive weeks. In other words, that's 2 million people filing for initial unemployment benefits. Now, those unemployment benefits don't represent the total unemployed, because some people can't get unemployment and some just drop out of the economy and they're not eligible for it. But if you look at that totality, clearly 22, 23 weeks, over 2 million people filing first-time unemployment. And then you look at the government, Bureau of Labor Statistics actually do job creation for 3 months, about 10 million. So we've lost about 50 million jobs. People filing for unemployment are dropping out, and we've gained back about 10 million of that. In other words, still very serious. We still have 40 million plus people jobless. And now when we cut off some of their unemployment benefits, many of that 40 million aren't getting unemployment benefits. That's like 25, 27% unemployment rate. That's as bad as it was during the worst time in the Great Depression. And that's why the Reinhardt's economists are saying we're in one. You know, depends what statistic you want to look at. We've had since March over 10 million small businesses and farms close, not open up, close and not open up. 80 million people now are without health insurance or inadequate health insurance. 80 million people. You know, we had 40 million uninsured before going into this, and now we got 40 million unemployed, and most of those don't have insurance now. Evictions. We had a partial moratorium on evictions as a result of the CARES Act in March. Well, that's expired, and depending on what source, we have between 12 and 28 million people being in some stage of rental evictions. There's 48 million rental units in the United States, but 108 million people. So that gives you, some idea of how serious the moratorium collapse on evictions really is. Hungry, we have tens of millions of people, food insecurity, and now even more with the problem with the schools opening and remote education. Millions of young kids were getting meals by going to school, and they're not going to school now. So that adds to those who are food insecure. And then COVID deaths, right? We're at 175,000 people, 175,000. Going to be 195,000 by Labor Day. And University of Washington epidemiologists have recently forecast that if things just stay in the way they are, with people refusing to wear masks and reopenings everywhere and social gatherings and so forth, we're going to have 310 million people infected. And, well, not infected, but 310,000, 310,000 deaths. 310,000 deaths by December. From 175 now to 300,000 deaths by September. So the picture is one of continued problems. It's not just that the recovery has the rebound, which is not a recovery, has stalled. It's that there's no sign it's going to get any better. So let's talk about that a little bit. All right. The rebound started in May, especially in those states that never really shut down, in the South in particular. And you can't keep dropping 30–40% in GDP and not have something of a rebound when you reopen the economy. And that's what we've had. Over the last couple months, we see a recovery in housing, residential housing. In a way, it's a little bit of a boomlet going on in housing. Well, that's because it was all bottled up in April, May, and June to some extent. No one was able to buy houses. And now you got that past demand flowing into the present here. But that won't be sustained for longer term. But you also have this other structural change going on in the housing economy where people are leaving their urban apartments, particularly in big cities and the middle class and wealthier. They're getting out of their condos and townhomes and they're trying to buy homes in the suburbia. And that's what's going on here as well. The demand is picking up for housing as a result of the urban exodus that's just beginning. That's more structural long term. Manufacturing is sort of stable, not really growing that much, and the jobs in manufacturing are not coming back. That's a big difference between the manufacturing indicators here. Well, apart from those two areas, housing and manufacturing, which is only 20% of GDP of the US economy, 80% of the economy is services, 80%. And we have the service sectors that have been deeply wounded by this whole event going on that aren't recovering, or very, very little recovering. You look at travel, you look at leisure, entertainment, restaurants and bars, not recovering at all. We got a partial shutdown going on to some extent, but it's pretty clear that they're not going to do any more shutdowns, even in the states that had shut down because of the economy and the election. They're going to keep it open, and they're going to trade off the 310,000 deaths for reopening the economy very clearly. In the South, Midwest, we see it occurring in colleges, social events, and so forth. So more shutdowns, more COVID impact on the economy. But we see unemployment claims rising again. Another indication the rebound is weakening. Shopping traffic is declining, except for online. We've got this $600 a week unemployment benefit, supplemental unemployment benefit, which went away in late July. That's taken out of the economy about $75 billion every month. That's a big drag on rebound and recovery. $75 billion a month just eliminated in consumption, which was already fairly weak. Small businesses, as I said, are beginning to close permanently. Their revenues are down. Those are still opened. Consumer sentiment is down, and global trade and exports are down still. So all those factors are not conducive to generating a rebound that becomes sustained, i.e. a recovery. And the picture is one, therefore, in the last 6 months of a deep fall and contraction in the spring, a reopening and a partial rebound, and since mid-July, a fading in many ways of that rebound. And now with the fading of a fiscal stimulus, we have a real problem going forward here. Back in March, I had argued that we needed to spend $4 trillion in fiscal stimulus. If we were in a war economy and fighting a war, which we are with the virus, a war economy requires $4 trillion. That's what we spent in 40-41 to get out of the Depression. $4 trillion equivalent. In other words, GDP spending of doubling of what we got from 20% to 40%. 40% of GDP is what the government must spend to get out of this, and it must be fiscal spending, not monetary spending, not spending for loans for bankers and for big corporations and tax cuts for corporations. None of that has any real effect. In fact, if you look at the CARES Act that was passed in March, that was supposed to be the stimulus up to now. And what was that? $3 trillion. $3 trillion was the CARES Act. Well, it didn't get spent as 3 trillion. Only half of that has really, well, less than half of that has actually gotten into the economy. Look at the CARES Act. $500 billion for unemployment benefits and checks, supplemental checks. Well, that's been spent. PPP for small businesses, grants. Well, they call them loans, but they're really grants. They're giving them money. $350 billion. Initially, a lot of big corporations scammed it and took some of that, so they had to pass another $320 billion in PPP for small businesses. That's been spent. Okay, that got into the economy, those two items, as well as about $200 billion to help hospitals and testing and so forth. So that's about 1.3, 1.4 trillion of the announced 3 trillion. Well, what is the other 1.6 trillion that hasn't been spent, hasn't gotten into the economy? Well, 600 billion of it is loans for medium-sized corporations. That was called the Main Street program. Well, less than 100 billion of that has actually been used by businesses. And then you have the $500 billion more in loans for bigger corporations. And again, less than 100 billion has actually been taken up by those large corporations. Then there's finally $650 billion in business tax cuts, 3% of which goes to people earning $100,000 a year or less. So it's all business investor wealthy tax cuts, $650 billion. So you have $650 billion, $500 billion for large corporations, $600 billion for medium size. None of that has gotten into the economy. Why not? Well, because business is just not borrowing it. They don't need it. They don't need it because they're already fat with cash. They're sitting on over $3 trillion cash hoard that they accumulated immediately at the beginning of the year through various means. One, by issuing over $1.5 trillion in corporate bonds. They issued those bonds and they sat on it, made possible by the Federal Reserve's almost zero interest rates. You know, it's great to borrow at zero and then sell it to investors and hold on to the cash. That's what businesses did. They drew down hundreds of billions of dollars in credit lines with their banks. They suspended paying out dividends, which is about 400 billion dividends and buybacks every quarter. And then they cut their cost in many ways. You know, workers weren't working full time and, you know, operational costs. So they accumulated over $3 trillion. Just in the second quarter alone, businesses added 2.2 trillion in cash to their business accounts. Just the Fortune 500 added 2.2 trillion. They parked it in their accounts in the banks. So they didn't need the 1.6 trillion in tax cuts and corporate loans, but it's still there for them if they want. And the rest of us have run out of the 1.3 trillion expenditures, you know, for based on unemployment benefits and the checks and the grants to small business and so forth. Now, on top of that 3 trillion, you got to remember that the Federal Reserve, the central bank, also provided 3 trillion for banks and non-banks. 3 trillion, okay? It's there as well, hardly been taken up. The Fed is buying $120 billion a month in bonds, including corporate bonds and exchange-traded funds and so forth. They've got what they call 11 special facilities ready for different sectors of the financial economy, you know, for mutual funds and municipal bond funds and so forth, just sitting there. So there's $3 trillion plus another $1.6 trillion sitting there for big businesses and corporations and bankers and investors, should they need it. And we're quibbling over trying to bail out 100 million households here, working class and small business households. They're quibbling over it. Well, it kind of explains why Mitch McConnell and the Senate and Trump don't want to spend more, you see, because their main constituent is the big corporations and bankers, and they're sitting fat. They don't need any more. You know, these are the guys who pay for their campaigns. They don't need any more. So, you know, they don't want to spend any more on the rest. And that leads us to the conflict we got now going in Congress over the stimulus bill. You know, back in late May, June, the House of Representatives, dominated by the Democrats, proposed what was called the Heroes Bill of $3 trillion in stimulus. And in many ways, it was pretty good. You know, it continued the $600 special supplemental unemployment that 28 million unemployed were getting. It raised the amount of the checks that people were supposed to get, supplemental checks, provided $100 billion for rental assistance, provided $900 billion over the next 18 months for state and local governments that are now going broke. And a whole number of other features. So it was a real stimulus bill, better than even the CARES Act, but it was dead on arrival in the Senate. And what you got in July was a counterproposal from McConnell in the Senate of $1 trillion, only $1 trillion. You know, it didn't include anything for state and local governments. And it did include rental assistance and a whole number of other areas. It did, by the way, interesting, provide for the $600 a month extension of unemployment benefits. But the Senate proposal, the HEALS Act, as they call it, ran head on into the ultra-conservative right wing in the Senate, led by Rand Paul, who said, oh, deficits, we can't afford it, right? We can't afford to spend a trillion more. The HEALS Act was $1 trillion. Heroes Act was $3 trillion. We can't spend any more. But these were the same guys in the Senate who quickly approved, you know, overnight Donald Trump's $4.5 trillion tax cut in 2018, and who have voted quickly to increase war and defense spending by hundreds of billions of dollars every time it came up, you know. And if you look at the $22 trillion U.S. deficit going into this thing, $15 trillion in tax cuts since 2001, $7 trillion in extra war spending and defense spending. That was your deficit, $22 trillion, right? So they argued, oh no, and it died in the Senate. You know, even McConnell couldn't pass $1 trillion bill. So then, you know, McConnell couldn't get the votes in the Senate even for $1 trillion, so he kicked it over to the Trump administration. And we had these negotiations that have been going on for a couple of weeks here. And they broke up about a week or so ago, if you remember. Trump's staff guy, Meadows, handling the Trump negotiation side, walked out, even after Pelosi and the Democrats agreed to reduce their $3 trillion to $1 trillion. You know, they thought, Schumer thought, well, we'll meet them at the middle, right? We'll go from $3 trillion to $2 trillion, and they were at $1 trillion. Maybe they'll move up to $2 trillion. Well, there was no intention of Trump and his negotiators, you know, Meadows, Mnuchin, to ever agree to anything like that. In fact, while Pelosi was reducing their offer by $1 trillion, they were putting together executive orders in which they were going to implement once they broke off negotiations. And that's what they did. They broke it off on a Friday, and within 12 hours, Trump had his executive orders out there taking control of negotiations. So they cleverly set up Pelosi and Schumer, got them to reveal their priorities, got them to reduce their proposal, and then they walked out. You know, this is classic Trump and classic bad faith bargaining. For many years, I was a union negotiator for various unions, and if any employer ever did that, set me up and retracted his proposal, reduced his proposal, I would have called a strike in 24 hours. I would have walked them out. Of course, Pelosi can't do that right now because that would have been playing right into Trump's hand. And they try to continue negotiating, but Trump now has control of the negotiating agenda. You know, what did he come up with within 24 hours? 4 phony executive orders that were just PR. What are they? Providing a $300 a week unemployment, special unemployment, instead of the $600 a week. $300. In other words, take about $35 billion out of the economy instead of $75 billion. Right? Oh, but you know, you don't get that 300 unless your state can pony up another 100 a week, and most states can't. They're exhausted. Their unemployment benefits are exhausted. And where are you going to get the money for that? Well, Trump is going to take it out of FEMA. You know, hurricane season approaching. FEMA has $44 billion. He's going to take the money from there, which will provide the $300 a week for about 5 weeks, and then that's it, you see. So you're just moving the money around, which, by the way, is unconstitutional. Money that's appropriated by Congress, the House, for a certain use has to be used for that. But Trump doesn't honor that anymore. You know, he didn't do that with the wall. He took the money out of the Pentagon and he built his wall with it. And then he backfilled what the Pentagon needed with the CARES Act. And then we're doing the same thing here with FEMA. He'll get the Democrats once the hurricane season hits. I mean, what? FEMA's got no money. They're not going to do anything. Yeah, they'll appropriate for that. He knows it. But we got a constitutional crisis here going on, and Trump got away with it with his wall, so now he's doing it again. That's the $300 benefit executive order number one. Executive order number two was a payroll tax cut. Now you got to remember, payroll taxes are paid equally by employers and by the workers. 6.2% each for Social Security and 1.45% for Medicare. Right? Now business already had deferred its payroll tax back in March with the CARES Act. They haven't been paying payroll taxes since then. Now it's a deferral, meaning that business has to pay it back, put it back in the Social Security Trust Fund by 2021, the end of 2021. So now Trump proposes to do the same thing here for workers, give them a payroll tax cut. Now, if you do that, that means workers got to pay it back next year. And they'll pay more taxes because they'll have more income when they pay it back, right? They'll pay it back next year. Or if they don't pay it back, then the employers who are legally responsible to make the distribution of the payroll taxes they collect from workers to the government will have to pay the worker share of the payroll tax themselves. So what they were doing, it was becoming clear that employers are saying, well, we're just going to collect it from the workers and sit on it. We're not going to send it to you because we may have to pay it back later. So it was just a can of worms. This payroll tax cut is just BS. It's PR and it's FUs to the Democrats, you see. Well, what about the moratorium executive order? Look at the moratorium executive order, and what does it say? It says, oh, the states should consider extending the moratorium on evictions. Consider. Right? And then the student debt deferral here for another 3 months, that was the fourth executive order. And none of this is a stimulus. This is all bargaining, maneuvering, election year maneuvering, and campaigning and so forth, and a way for Trump to get control of the bargaining agenda, which he has. Now, there's some talk also in the Senate of coming up with a skinny $500 billion stimulus. But that's going nowhere because Pelosi has said, no deal. You know, we're not going to fall for that. But the Republicans are trying to suck them in and make it conditional on providing $25 billion for the Postal Service, which is, of course, in deep trouble, purposely here by Trump, as part of his maneuvering to claim that the election is going to be fraudulent. And as he said today, we won't know the results of this election for months. You see, he's preparing the ground. It's becoming quite transparent where he's going to claim the election will be a fraud. And of course, he's putting as many obstacles in delivering the ballots as he can by slowing down what's going on in the postal office and taking out 600 sorting machines from the district postal services, 600. And then he has his buddy DeJoy there in Senate say, oh, you know, we won't do that. But workers are getting letters from their bosses saying, don't touch those sorting machines. Don't put them back, right? So we'll see what happens there. But you know, we got a real problem going on with the stimulus. There's no stimulus coming here. And if it comes, it will be just a little bit of token here and there. That's why the rebound, number one reason why the rebound is not going to turn into a recovery for the rest of this year. And we will continue on a W shape, kind of bouncing along the bottom. Now, on top of that, lack of fiscal stimulus and the economy already stalling out, we've got the problem of COVID appearing to get worse for a number of reasons in a number of places. And that's going to continue as we reopen and pretty much don't do much in the way of social distancing in a lot of places of the country and wearing a mask in a lot of places of the country. That's not going to happen. And people are going back to schools, and sports teams are trying to get together. At social events, they're trying to do it. So it's not going to get any better. And we're not going to have a real vaccine by November either. Trump just came out today and blamed the FDA, Federal Drug Administration, for interfering with the pharmaceutical companies developing vaccines. Well, you know, FDA reports to him. Wasn't he doing something about it if that's the case, right? But it's all about this diversion and creating a crisis and then delegitimizing the election coming up, which is his main plan B, you see. We could talk about more of what I think his plan B really is. But we're having political instability that's only going to get worse. And that will only have a further negative impact on the economy. Instability creates uncertainty by businesses and by households and consumers. And they don't spend, they don't invest as long as things are very uncertain. And that's a big problem. So we have a triple crisis. We got a COVID crisis that's not showing signs of really getting better. You know, it pops up here and then goes down here, but it's with us and remain with us. And as long as it's clear we're going to trade the economy for deaths, it will not be going away. It's not going away because we won't have an effective vaccine. And by the way, you know, 35% of the American public says, even if you have a vaccine, I'm not taking it, right? I would say 30% of the U.S. population is dumb as stones, really, when it comes to these kind of matters. COVID's not getting any better. The economy is structurally changing. It's not just COVID. If COVID went away yesterday, we would still have fundamental problems because we have big changes in consumption, the structure of consumption and shift in consumption patterns. People aren't going to jump on airplanes, neither is business. They're going to do it remotely now. You know, people aren't going to go to a lot of the social gatherings. The travel industry is really wounded here. It's not going to recover. So too with leisure and entertainment. So too with hotels. And of course, we've got bars and restaurants shutting down by the millions everywhere. This is not going to change, you see. So structural changes undergoing the economy while we have this cyclical impact of COVID, which is really the first crisis. The second crisis, of course, is what's going on politically here that's only going to exacerbate the situation. And the third crisis is if this thing drags on, if the economy does not really recover or stalls out, the problem grows that's already begun of defaults, debt defaults, and financial instability within the financial sector and the non-financial sector. Financial instability. We have massive debt accumulation over the last 10 years here, both households and corporations and government. And as long as you're making money and prices and revenue are rising, you can pay for the extra debt. But when you don't make the money, when your sales revenue drops off or your prices fall, which is happening, then you can't service your debt. You can't pay the principal and interest on that debt. And that means you default. When you default, maybe the banks will roll over your debt, maybe they won't. If they don't, then you go into bankruptcy chapter 11 or 13, and then we have massive debt defaults throughout the economy, and that has a major contagion effect on financial markets, and then we have a financial crash. We're not there yet, but if this thing keeps going on the trajectory with health in the economy and political instability, then we could very easily be there next year. And all the hallmarks of true depressions are when you have banking and financial crashes subsequent to an initial deep contraction of the economy. That's always been the case. So we are on the trajectory towards that, you know, the economists Carmen and Vincent Reinhardt said we're already in. Oh, well, I don't know. Maybe they're even ahead of me on some of this. I don't know. Well, they emphasize the global picture, the global economy being even worse in some cases than the U.S. So they're very much aware of that. I'm not going to get into talking about the global. It's a question and topic all by itself. But the triple crisis, to summarize, triple crisis is COVID's here, not going away, going to get worse in some ways, going to negatively impact the economy. Secondly, deep contraction. You don't get out of it quickly. There's signs that it's stagnating and stalling out. No fiscal stimulus to do anything really about it. Structural changes in the economy going on, and political instability around the corner, getting more intensive every day, and then financial crisis somewhere, probably in 2021, if we don't stop the whole trajectory. Okay, well, that's my picture of where we're going here and where we are now and where we've been.